the strongest secret special forces in Korea. A man in military uniform and a mask covering half of his face looks ahead. On his head is a helmet with a night vision instrument. Several other team members stand in a single line with weapons drawn. Special Unit 709. Several people stand in a row with a helicopter behind them. And now there is a special promotion ceremony held there. The hand is clenched tightly into a fist, blood dripping from the knuckles. Everyone must fight until only one of them remains. The man with short brown hair took a defensive stance. There are blood stains on his face and clothes. One eye is closed due to being hit. He knitted his eyebrows and looked intensely ahead. A fight for life. The next moment, the man is hit in the face by a huge hand clenched into a fist, causing his face to immediately change. The man immediately fell face down on the ground with a loud sound. In front of him stood another man whose only legs were visible. This tradition was cancelled by one person. The huge man grinned, his body covered in scars and blood stains. With a smile on his face, he called the next one. All members of the unit are unable to continue serving. Cumulative time taken to complete recovery, 448 weeks. A huge man stood in a brick building. To his side was an iron staircase, and on the concrete floor lay many bodies of men in dark uniforms, beaten and groaning. Due to the appearance of an extremely powerful and crazy scoundrel, the man was grinning madly, a dark, menacing aura emanating from him. With the same grin on his face, he asked if anyone else wanted to play with him. After the incident, the frightened members of the unit wanted to leave the unit. An older man was sitting at the table, clutching a pen in his hands. He had several scars on his face and was dressed in military uniform. He frowned darkly and said to himself, "Crazy wretch," and on the table in front of him lay a lot of tablets with punishment forms. And the reason everyone wanted to leave was the forced dismissal subject, who became a legend. A photograph of a man in uniform with the stamp insufficient qualifications for appointment stamped above it and the name Kim Joo-hyuk at the bottom. Thanks to this, the legend of the secret special forces became known to the general public. 3 years later, the multi-story building rose high up, illuminated by the sun. A man with a tired and exhausted face, bruises under his eyes and glasses, was hit in the face by a crumpled wad of paper. The man who threw it at him sat with a look of disgust on his face. He grimaced and asked him if this company really looked like an end to him, and didn't he really know how to behave. He continued to throw wads of paper in his direction and asked that how could an office worker sleep at work. A man wearing glasses sat at his desk while wads of paper continued to fly towards him. The man with glasses awkwardly scratched his cheek and asked for forgiveness, but wondered what he had thrown there. He looked down at the table and saw a wad of paper in front of him, and decided that it was a napkin. The man who threw them at him held a napkin near his nose and said that these were napkins that he usually blows his nose in, and since there was no trash can, it would be nice if Kim Joo-hyuk threw them out for him. The man continued to say this with a straight face, continuing to throw used napkins in his direction while sitting next to him. The veins on Kim Joo-hyuk's face immediately popped out and her lips pursed tightly. In his head he thought insulting words about him. Kim Joo-hyuk grabbed his phone and opened a forum where the Bullied website was written. The topic is company life, and the question was asked, what happens in the workplace? My boss threw napkins at me. Kim Joo-hyuk believed that he was clearly crossing the line. The man continued to type quickly with his fingers on the phone, typing angry text on the screen. Kim Joo-hyuk decided that he would tell everything about the affairs of this scoundrel in Bullied. Kim Joo-hyuk angrily typed the text, which already stated that the person who calls himself the boss not only shifts all the work onto him, but also throws at him his dirty napkins, which he had previously blown his nose in, and that he thinks they should create an effective cyclical structure by firing or transferring employees whose performance is detrimental to the company. And the more he thinks about it, the angrier he gets. Did he imagine himself to be his army sergeant major? Hamlo, if this scoundrel had been his junior in the army, he would definitely have corrected his character and taught him how to behave in society. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to mindlessly tap the screen while typing. He added that if he is reinstated, he will definitely teach this scoundrel a lesson before resigning. There must be a limit to his arrogance. After all, it is not he who pays him the money. Kim Joo-hyuk's face looked furious, the veins on his face continued to bulge, and his jaw was clenched tightly. He put the phone back. Kim Joo-hyuk leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly, finally calming down. But he still has to endure it. Kim Joo-hyuk looked madly at the man. In his other hand he held a sharp pencil and thought that he couldn't kill him like that because his opponent was a civilian. Suddenly he was distracted by a notification on his phone screen and saw that there was a reply under his forum post, and he saw a comment asking if anyone knew how to get to the bottom of dude. Kim Joo-hyuk picked up the phone and carefully read the contents on the screen. He read from the screen that someone had written that they would give him a chance, a slave of a capitalist society. He did not immediately understand what kind of chance he was talking about, and what the puppet project was, which was mentioned below. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at the screen and couldn't understand what it was all about. Suddenly, a small red dot lights up on the side of the temple of his glasses. Kim Joo-hyuk's face distorted, as if he had been shocked. After a couple of seconds, everything stopped and he stared ahead, not quite understanding what had just happened. He frowned slightly as he thought about it. Suddenly, Kim Joo-hyuk noticed something began to appear on the lenses of his glasses, and he stared in front of him, his eyes wide. The screen showed information that its registration was completed. The P99 under test is confirmed and the connection is completed. Kim Joo-hyuk adjusted his glasses, not quite understanding what was going on, and frowned slightly. He asked himself what it was. The following system notification was displayed, in which it was written that the first test for P99 was starting. Kim Joo-hyuk pulled his glasses back and looked at them with a puzzled expression, wondering if there was a voice in his head. He took off his glasses and noticed that there was a black thread coming from the glasses, which was attached to his temple. There was a voice that said, "Warning, if you don't wear your glasses for more than 60 seconds, you will get an electric shock." Kim Joo-hyuk wondered if they really told him that he couldn't take them off anymore. Kim Joo-hyuk looked over and in his peripheral vision saw a black thread extending from his temple. His company gave him these glasses a long time ago, and what was going on here? Suddenly, a voice called his name, and Kim Joo-hyuk immediately jumped up in surprise. A girl approached him and asked if everything was okay. It was a young girl with dark long hair and eyes who smiled sweetly at him and held the tablet close to her. It was Miss Soo-yeon. Soo-yeon came closer and said that he looked a little unwell. Kim Joo-hyuk was holding his glasses uncertainly and was about to talk about them when a system notification popped up and said that if he told anyone about the glasses to strangers, he would immediately get an electric shock. He looked uncertainly at Soo-yeon, who stood next to his desk. Kim Joo-hyuk put his glasses back on and said with an uncertain smile that everything was fine and nothing serious had happened. Soo-yeon straightened her hair, tucking it behind her ear, and with a smile on her face replied that she was glad to hear this, and wanted to add something about what they could do today after work when their conversation was interrupted by the boss, who abruptly walked up behind her. Kim Joo-hyuk put his hand on his shoulder with a crazy smile, looking at the girl and asking what happened to the two of them, and what kind of strange atmosphere they had. Was it really a private meeting? The boss smiled disgustingly and pointed at himself, saying that in this case they would allow him to join, because he just knew one wonderful bar. He walked closer to Soo-yeon and leaned slightly towards her, saying that since Mr. Kim Joo-hyuk would have to work late again today, why not spend the evening with him? Soo-yeon stood with a neutral expression. The boss added that no attention should be paid to people who have to work overtime due to their incompetence. Kim Joo-hyuk leaned over the table and clenched his hands into fists. His whole body began to shake, and veins stood out on his hands. Soo-yeon looked away and remained silent when the boss grinned and told her to look, because Kim Joo-hyuk couldn't even say a word against it, and apparently his self-esteem was letting him down. Soo-yeon silently turned around and walked away, saying that in this case, perhaps, she would simply return to her workplace. Kim Joo-hyuk's face contorted with anger and fury, and he thought to himself that did it really look like he was getting away with it because he was a fool? And aren't they just at work now? The boss put his hands in his pockets and looked at Kim Joo-hyuk, saying what was so good about this fool, except that others simply liked him. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to shake and only thought that this was not the most important problem right now anyway. A system notification was displayed, which indicated the information: P99, name, Kim Joo-hyuk, age, 28, profession, office employee, mission creation algorithm completed. Kim Joo-hyuk perked up slightly when he heard this information. The light on the temple of his glasses began to beep. He was assigned a mission. Another system notification popped up that said, "Analyze the people around you." Kim Joo-hyuk turned his gaze to the boss, and various diagrams and information appeared before his eyes. Scanning began to occur. The boss, meanwhile, continued to talk to him and asked if he wanted to pay attention to him and who he was talking to then. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him with a shocked face and could not understand what was happening while the boss asked what was wrong with him. The system voice said that the first system had been issued, and Kim Joo-hyuk's gaze widened in surprise. The boss came closer and frowned with displeasure, asking him if he was really some kind of joke for Kim Joo-hyuk. A system notification popped up and stated, "Department Chief Choi Jae-hong has been selected as the target of the mission. Mission 1, tell the target to stop swearing." Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes in surprise when another system notification was displayed, which said that if you fail to complete the mission within the specified time frame, you will be punished. The boss walked away from his desk and waved his hand, beckoning him to follow him and saying that they should talk and discuss everything on the roof. Kim Joo-hyuk was still sitting in place and could not understand what kind of mission and punishment they were talking about, and what kind of strange situation this was. A system notification appeared that said 10 seconds until the deadline, and the report began to run. Kim Joo-hyuk was still staring in front of him in amazement and thinking that this must be some kind of high-tech augmented reality device developed by the company, and they must be using employees to experience it. And did he really forget to check a couple of points when he signed the contract? Kim Joo-hyuk looked at his hand, which was shaking as the countdown continued. He was thinking that maybe there must have been hidden cameras or something. Or if not, then maybe he's just gone crazy. Kim Joo-hyuk looked madly in front of him, still not understanding what was happening. The countdown has already reached 0, and a notification was displayed in which it was written that a punishment had been assigned, followed by information. Account: Kim Joo-hyuk, 640,910,143, loss percentage 50%. Kim Joo-hyuk's eyes widened when he saw the red sign in front of his eyes. Was it really something like his account? Kim Joo-hyuk picked up the phone and with a puzzled face thought about what this even meant, this 50%. He looked at the phone, which showed Guanba's contact. It wasn't even funny anymore. He opened the application, which showed the account status. The deposit status was 14,403,000 and the current balance was 14,400,000. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes in surprise. He immediately jumped up from his seat, slamming his hands on the table and saying that it already looked like some kind of madness. The rest of the employees in the office immediately looked back at him questioningly when Kim Joo-hyuk froze in place. People around him could be heard whispering, asking what it was and what even happened. Kim Joo-hyuk hesitated uncertainly when the boss's voice came to him and asked if this applied to him now. The boss looked back at him over his shoulder with a crazed expression on his face, veins popping out on his temples. After some time, the two of them were already standing on the roof. It was already dark outside. The boss stood in front of Kim Joo-hyuk with his hands in his trouser pockets as he stood in front of him with his head down. The boss came closer and began poking him in the chest with his finger, asking if he had really gone completely crazy. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to stand silently in front of him with his head down. He asked for forgiveness when the boss irritably asked what he was really doing. The boss took out a cigarette with a lighter and lit it, frowning slightly and asking Kim Joo-hyuk if he knew why the boss hated guys like him. What he must have thought was that he looked cool by going to the gym a little, but the way Kim Joo-hyuk acts just pisses him off. The boss frowned, looking at the guy from under his brows with a cigarette clamped in his mouth. He then added that it also seemed to him that Kim Joo-hyuk was avoiding him not because he was afraid, but because he simply considered him disgusting. He continued to hold the cigarette and told him to tell him straight out if that was really the case. The boss smiled and opened his eyes, asking Kim Joo-hyuk if he thought he was trash. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to stand with his head down and thought only that he must remain silent if he wants to earn a living. Kim Joo-hyuk leaned over and frowned slightly, asking for forgiveness. He stood and thought about what he had to endure. Suddenly a voice snapped him out of his thoughts as he was asked why he was holding back. Kim Joo-hyuk perked up and saw Soo-yeon walking up to them with a smile on her face and crossing her arms over her chest. The girl smiled and asked if Kim Joo-hyuk was really that stupid. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at her a little puzzled, not expecting to see her here. Soo-yeon smiled and said that they live in a time where it is difficult to buy a house for yourself even if you work your last legs, and he must also be tired of working all day, so why is he running around with this nonentity? Soo-yeon winked and added that he should know when to let everything go away in this imperfect world. The girl was holding a voice recording tool in her hands and pressed it when quotes from the boss were heard from the speaker, who had previously talked about why he hates people like Kim Joo-hyuk and how he is infuriated by the way he behaves. The boss and Kim Joo-hyuk turned in her direction, both looking extremely surprised. The girl said that Kim Joo-hyuk shouldn't have been so upset, because it's not him who should apologize. Soo-yeon leaned slightly in his direction and showed off the recorder in her hands with a satisfied smile. Soo-yeon turned towards the boss and asked what he thought about this. The boss frowned and asked what she thought she was doing. He immediately jumped up from his seat and, with a mad face, rushed towards her, shouting that she should immediately delete the recording of his voice. Soo-yeon stepped back in horror and closed her eyes, turning her face to the side and ready to take the blow, when Kim Joo-hyuk grabbed his hand and squeezed his wrist tightly. The boss immediately looked back at him and said that they both must have completely mixed up something and forgot their place. The boss started shouting with an angry face to let him go immediately. Kim Joo-hyuk saw a system notification in front of him, which stated that the target's aggressive words and behavior had been recorded. Kim Joo-hyuk said that it was dangerous and that he wished he hadn't stretched his arm like that. He continued to squeeze the chief's hand while he grinned in response and looked at him with crazy eyes. A notification of the system was displayed in which it was written that the mission was issued. Hit the Adam's apple target, which applied a bushy vocabulary, a reward for a mission of 200% profit. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to tighten his hand tightly, saying that since he was so patient, he was inclined to endure many things, but only when they treat him alone. Kim Joo-hyuk gritted his teeth and frowned, the veins on his face swelled. The boss sharply pulled out his hand and bounced, with a crazy face, to say that he seemed to survive completely from his mind since he suddenly became so confident in himself. The boss rushed in his direction, intending to strike with a loud cry about whether Kim Joo-hek was sure that he could deal with this. Kim Joo-hek dodged his blows with ease, asking for his question and clarifying. His hand strained and he replied that since he was so interested, he could try this before applying the boss directly to the Adam's apple. The boss immediately grimaced in his face and his breath caught his breath. Kim Joo-hek, with a smile on his face, added that since only one garbage climbs from his mouth, he will ask him to shut up. The boss fell on his back and flew to the side. He turned to the girl who stood behind him and she responded. Kim Joo-hek said, turning to her, that he would like to ask her to have to behave from that moment as if there was nothing. Kim Joo-hek stood his back to her, an aura emanated from him. A notification of the system was displayed, which stated that the mission was fulfilled. The award for the success of the mission was accrued. A notification of the system was displayed in which it was written that the account is now 100%. The status of the account changed, and now it was plus 14,403,000, and the current balance was 28,806,300. Kim Joo-hek took out the phone and looked at the screen with a satisfied smile, saying that it now became clear how it works as a result. The boss held onto his throat and turned towards Kim Joo-hek, asking him that he must have been crazy, and how did he dare to hit him, his boss. There was a notification of the system in which it was written that there are no changes in the behavior or speech of the goal. The creation of a second-level mission, please beat the target, a reward for the success of the mission of 500%. From this moment he is no longer interested in who gives out mission. Kim Joo-hek stood in front of the boss, who continued to hold onto his bruised throat. Or what a goal he is, because he can do something funny for the first time since he joined the company. Kim Joo-hek smiled madly, wrapping his sleeves of the shirt along the elbow. His hands were tense, the veins were swollen on them. The boss's face immediately changed and he tensed, frowning and asking Kim Joo-hek that he seems to be specially drawn. The boss got into the protective rack. Kim Joo-hek could not restrain himself because the only reason was the opportunity to earn money for life. The boss broke up and had already flew in his direction, ready to strike. Kim Joo-hek immediately grabbed his hand. However, if now he can get money in a similar way, no matter what it is, it makes no sense to refuse. Kim Joo-hek smiled madly when his hand rushed towards the boss and wrapped around him. He took him into a suffocating grip, tightly pushing his throat with his hand. The boss hung in his grip, his face began to blue. Kim Joo-hek leaned over his ear and said that this would end so soon. Kim Joo-hek smiled madly while he watched how slowly the boss blows and loses consciousness. The next moment, he let him go and the man fell face to the ground. A notification of the system in which it was written was displayed. Victory, the mission was completed successfully. Kim Joo-hek stood above the body of the boss, who let the saliva from his mouth and lay face into the ground. Kim Joo-hek took out the phone from his pocket and saw a sign that the profit increased by plus 500%. He saw an account of his current balance. Kim Joo-hek looked up at the sky, smiling insanely and saying that the money is really just multiplying by themselves. Now his account was 170 million or $128,000. A man in a dark suit sat at a table on which stood a sign that said interviewer. He crossed his arms and asked one more question. Namely, why did he decide that he was suitable for this position? Kim Joo-hek sat in a suit with a smile on his face and answered the question, saying that he was exceptionally successful at completing tasks, and that all he had to do was give him a task and there would be no one who could do it better than him. He was trying to live a normal life like everyone else before everything happened. A system notification popped up stating that the mission progress was 2 out of 10. Even after the rooftop situation, mysterious missions continued to appear. A system notification popped up that said, reveal to everyone the fact that Chief Jin Sang wears a wig, plus 8.82%. Kim Joo-hek was standing behind the wall when he picked up the wig with a fishing rod and made it fly off the man's head. He completed all the missions that promised him more money. Another system notification popped up and said, pour soda on director Kim Gundee's orchid. Kim Joo-hek stood with a can of soda with a crazy smile, pouring it on the flower. Several more notifications appeared with different missions, such as, order sushi only for yourself during lunch, plus 19.51%. Stay overnight in the CEO's office, plus 57.14%. Expose manager Park Gap-soo's love affair, plus 51.95%. Kim Joo-hek grinned contentedly. As a result, in just 3 days, he already had 580 million won. Kim Joo-hek looked at his account, which showed that the deposit status was 587,560,201 and the current balance was 587,560,201. The money continued to multiply. Kim Joo-hek laughed madly, shouting that he was rich now. Kim Joo-hek stood in the middle of the street and laughed madly. Suddenly his laughter was interrupted by a drone flying closer and closer to him. Suddenly, the drone dropped a small dark box into his hands, and Kim Joo-hyuk caught it, looking at the box with an uncomprehending look. The voice said that the P-99 test had been passed. Kim Joo-hyuk looked blankly at the thing in his hands. He opened the box and saw a golden ticket inside. Kim Joo-hyuk took the ticket out of the box and began to look at it blankly. The system notification said that those who pass the test will be allowed to proceed to the main mission, collect 1 billion won in 7 days. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his mouth in surprise and did not understand what it meant. A drone in the sky, with a puppet like a doll attached to the top, said that if the participant fails to accumulate 1 billion won within this period, then moving on to the next stage will not be possible. The drone-mounted puppet's head smiled madly as its eyes glowed with a bright light and a red line ran through the location of its mouth. The doll added that all money will be reset to 0. Kim Joo-hyuk sat at his desk and looked at his phone, puzzled. How would it be possible to raise 1 billion in 7 days? He was still 420 million short. However, what was this ticket for? Kim Joo-hyuk held out his hand with the ticket and examined it carefully. He saw the inscription on the ticket, which said that this ticket allowed him to borrow up to 100 million per use. This was too little information available. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at the ticket carefully. He had no idea what this mission was exactly about. He also needs to understand where the glasses came from and whether they were actually made by his company. Kim Joo-hyuk thoughtfully touched his glasses with his hand, pursing his lips. He raised his head and saw the boss with a paper cup in his hands, who walked past him in front, his head down. Kim Joo-hyuk decided that there was no one to ask when he noticed his former boss. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately jumped up and greeted him with a crazy smile, addressing him as a manager. The man immediately froze in place and then turned with horror on his face towards Kim Joo-hyuk, who was waving his hand at him with a satisfied smile on his face and telling him that he was really just afraid to look him in the eyes, and it's better to just come up until he did it himself. The man looked away in horror and trembled, thinking about what he should do, and was it too late to pretend that he had not heard anything? After all, he tried so hard to avoid him all these days. Kim Joo-hyuk was already nearby when the man jumped up in horror. The guy came up to him and leaned over, saying that he had a question. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately covered his mouth with his hand to stop him from screaming. He put his finger to his lips and with a threatening aura told him to just calmly answer his question. Kim Joo-hyuk stuck his finger out and asked him if he happened to know if the glasses were made by their company. The man, with tears in his eyes, immediately shook his head from side to side, saying that he didn't know. Kim Joo-hyuk asked him again, asking if he hadn't heard anything about this. The aura around him thickened and he said out loud about turning on the lie detector. The man immediately covered himself with his hands and said loudly that it was the truth and that he really didn't know anything. Kim Joo-hyuk thought to himself about something, then judging by the answer, he really isn't lying. He pointed his finger at himself and asked again if he had seen similar glasses in their company. The man looked down and said that no, he didn't see it. In that case, it was a lie that they were from the company. There was too little information. While Kim Joo-hyuk was thinking about his own thoughts, the circuit diagrams of the system suddenly flashed before his eyes. The guy smiled madly and said that, however, he thought he could leave work early today. A system notification appeared that said, in 30 minutes a game will start nearby, a game with a reward of 300 million. Kim Joo-hyuk turned around and was about to leave the office with a satisfied smile, thinking to himself about rowing when the tide comes in. Before leaving, he slowed down and said that he had something that needed his attention, so let the boss deal with what was left there. The boss wanted to stop him, saying that he already had plans for today, to which Kim Joo-hyuk replied that if he did not want his throat to be cut, then it would be better to work overtime. The boss frowned, the veins on his face stood out, and tears rolled out of his eyes. It was already dark outside. There were unfinished buildings in the middle of the street, and in the middle of them stood a working crane. Kim Joo-hyuk stopped when he found himself at a construction site and wondered if he had arrived at the right place. He activated his glasses and wondered if this was the location his glasses indicated. A system notification appeared that said, the game competition between participants will begin soon. Kim Joo-hyuk wondered which members we could be talking about and whether there was anyone else besides him. Another system notification popped up that said, competition for a bag of money, the one who ends up at the end with a bag of money wins. Suddenly, spotlights brightly illuminated the surrounding construction site. Kim Joo-hyuk stood thoughtfully and thought about this competition for the bag of money. He walked over to the table and saw a suitcase lying on top of it and wondered if this could be the very bag he was looking for. He opened the bag and decided that this definitely couldn't happen, and how could it just lie here like that? Kim Joo-hyuk opened the bag and saw that there were huge wads of money inside. The guy noticed this and decided that she really was full. A system notification was displayed that said, as a rule, the participant who is holding the bag and lost it loses an amount of money equal to its contents for the remaining time of 10 minutes. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled madly and thought that if he held her for 10 minutes, he could get 300 million. The The countdown has begun. For himself, he decided that if this was the case, then he must protect this bag at the cost of his life. Suddenly he was interrupted, and a crowd of young people appeared behind him. Several armed young boys held their weapons at the ready, and one with a bat on his shoulder and a wry smile said that he should not have taken it so quickly. The guy with the bat on his shoulder grinned and asked if he was glowing too much. He had dark short hair and dark eyes. Another, who had a small knife in his hands, asked if he was really a beginner who was playing for the first time. The man with the knife had long scars on his face and blonde hair. And the third, with huge ears and a hat with another knife at the ready, smiled madly and said that today he would definitely have an unforgettable experience. They said they didn't want to get punished for murder, so it would be good if he simply and calmly left the bag and left. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at them in surprise and asked if they were also participants. He added what should they do then, because he didn't want to do this at all, and why were they trying to steal the bag? The guys grinned and asked what he was talking about and what kind of theft attempt they were talking about. They looked at him carefully and asked if he still didn't understand the whole situation. Kim Joo-hyuk adjusted his glasses on his face and calmly asked what exactly was there for what he needed to understand, because he just needed to beat them and that's it. One of the men began to laugh, and the other asked that he had apparently completely lost his mind due to the desire for profit. The man with the bat smiled and asked him if Kim Joo-hyuk knew who they even were. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled back, threatening karma emanating from him. He asked who they were and whether they themselves knew who he was. The guy with the bat's face twisted into an annoyed grimace. The next second, he rushed towards him with a bat at the ready and screamed at him, saying that he was still acting too arrogant and it was better for him to just die. The guy swung his bat when Kim Joo-hyuk put his suitcase in front of him and blocked the blow with it. Kim Joo-hyuk said that it was very good for a braggart. The guy stared at him incomprehensibly and did not immediately understand what had happened. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled crazily and told him that he failed to judge the situation correctly. Backfire. Kim Joo-hyuk raised his hand and raised it above his face, then punched him in the face. The guy immediately flew off in the other direction. The two boys looked at what happened with shock on their faces. Kim Joo-hyuk adjusted his glasses on his face and said that if all the participants were at the same level, then it might be even easier than he thought. The guy smiled madly and left. The two guys looked at each other without each other, after which they returned their attention to Kim Joo-hyuk. He smiled and told them that they seemed to have some sort of teamwork going on and they even managed to get into position. They surrounded him on both sides and loudly said that they would better see if he would speak the same way after they pierced him with a knife. Two guys immediately rushed towards him with weapons at the ready. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes and with a couple of blows forced them to cover their faces from the dust that he raised, sending in their direction. The man with the knife jumped up and asked what he was going to do now if his ancestors would help him. Kim Joo-hyuk turned around sharply. He began to swing the dagger, and Kim Joo-hyuk dodged all the blows, mocking and asking with a smile on his face if he even knew how to use a dagger. The guy angrily rushed at him again, shouting that it was time for him to die quickly. He stopped abruptly and said that that was precisely why he warned and told him to better leave the bag and leave. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him and asked what he was talking about. He stopped his dagger with the handle of his suitcase. Kim Joo-hyuk frowned and said that the use of the dagger was now a failure. The dagger broke and a piece of its blade flew into the air. The man looked at all this with shock on his face. He opened his eyes in horror and asked who he even was. Kim Joo-hyuk swung his suitcase and hit him on the head. The man immediately fell face down on the ground. Kim Joo-hyuk repeated his question and clarified whether he asked him about who he was. He brushed the dust off his shoulder and said that he was just an ordinary Special Forces veteran. 709 Secret Special Task Force. Kim Joo-hyuk looked back before leaving and said that if you think about it like that, he has one more question. One of the guys rubbed his eyes and stood opposite him, holding his weapon in front of him. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him and said that if they weren't going to attack him now, then he had something he wanted to ask them. The man rubbed his eyes in confusion and asked what was going on. Kim Joo-hyuk ignored his outrage and asked if they knew that he was running the game. The man looked at him incredulously and said that how would they know, and that he simply received this device and became a participant. The guy with the knife showed his wrist, which had a bracelet-like device on it. It was a device that was a watch, not glasses like his. Kim Joo-hyuk lowered it thoughtfully and thought that this only meant that there were different options. Kim Joo-hyuk looked away and asked himself that there seemed to be no difference in application, so why only him? The guy immediately noticed that Kim Joo-hyuk was distracted and bared his teeth in irritation, holding the knife at the ready. He couldn't believe that Kim Joo-hyuk was acting so careless around him, and this was definitely his chance. However, he didn't have time to do anything when the figure of Kim Joo-hyuk was already looming over him with a threatening look and asked that he really wanted to try to stab him with it too. The guy immediately began to sweat and his eyes began to squint in different directions, and he replied that no, of course not. Kim Joo-hyuk asked that this apparently meant that he was not going to attack him, but he was really going to hit him. Kim Joo-hyuk swung his suitcase with a crazy smile and hit him in the jaw, knocking him out. He immediately fell to the ground. Kim Joo-hyuk stood nearby and asked if they were too weak. Suddenly, he heard someone's indignant voice and turned his attention to the scream. The man with the dagger shouted for it to stop immediately and that it was unfair. He looked at his watch, which said a system notification that 300 million would be withdrawn from the account according to the rules, and R16 was now bankrupt. He started shouting indignantly about what a stupid rule this was because he was just hit with a bag and he wasn't even holding it. The next system notification sounded that the debt had reached its maximum of 1 billion and that debt collection would begin now. He continued to shout and asked to stop when a red light appeared from under the clock and another system notification was heard, which stated that an investigation was underway into the case of R16. Kim Joo-hyuk looked in his direction with confusion and wondered what it was and what was happening now. The guy grabbed his head, his body began to become covered with purple lines, his eyes became bloodshot. He reached out his hand to Kim Joo-hyuk and asked him to save him when he fell to the ground the next second. Kim Joo-hyuk looked and did not understand what happened. He squinted slightly and wondered if it was because he had been injected with something, and if there was an injector on the device. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes and realized that this could only mean that he should have been wearing those glasses too. He grabbed his glasses and grabbed them with his eyes wide. He couldn't believe that they even seemed prepared for such a situation. Suddenly a voice was heard. The stranger said that a fish was caught on a hook, and a man blinded by money, they were no different, and now there is no turning back. Two people stood behind Kim Joo-hyuk, wrapping the corpses in a sheet and attaching an iron chain to them. There were masks on their faces, and cloaks were thrown over their shoulders. One of the masked men looked madly ahead and his red eyes were visible as he said that the participants would either become fabulously rich or lose everything. The second masked man added that there was no other choice. They held the chains tightly in their hands. Only then did he realize. Kim Joo-hyuk looked over his shoulder and began to sweat. All participants in this game were influenced by money. Two masked men loaded the last body of a man with daggers into a bag. Kim Joo-hyuk looked up at the sky and saw several drones flying by. It's all about money. The image of Kim Joo-hyuk was reflected on the screen, where there were also many other screens with broadcasts. They all became puppets of money. In a room with a bunch of screens, notifications were heard that listed the participants and said that they were picking up P16, sending P17, transporting a bankrupt participant. Kim Joo-hyuk looked down and said to himself that he was constantly thinking about why all the missions seemed so easy to him, and that it wouldn't be like that anymore. The initial missions were just bait and testing. Kim Joo-hyuk was scratching the back of his head when a crowd of people appeared in front of him. Real game. A system notification appeared that said, there are 48 people participating in the hunt for a bag of money. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and said that this seemed like a bit much. It begins now. People began to slowly surround Kim Joo-hyuk from all sides with weapons ready. The remaining time was 6:40. Snowy mountains rose in the vastness, covered with snow. Snow fell from the sky, covering them with even more snow. On the ground in the snow, traces of animals that had passed earlier were visible. The tiger stood at the edge of the forest. The top of the food chain is the Siberian tiger. The animal bared its teeth, showing its fangs. If this predator encounters a pack of wolves, even he will have to be careful. A pack of wolves began to grin, slowly coming out to meet the tiger from the other side of the forest. But for this man, such things did not even matter. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled madly, looking at the crowd from under his brows. He told them that since things had turned out this way, they could attack all at once. Kim Joo-hyuk laughed madly, his eyes lit up with fire. With the same smile, he said that it had been a long time since he had been able to warm up well. People immediately rushed towards him, shouting that they would receive 300 million won if they could defeat him, and that he must be captured as quickly as possible. Kim Joo-hyuk looked madly in front of him, an evil fire lit up in his eyes. He asked them if they really wanted to catch him. He held the bag tightly in his hand and swung it at the first person who was nearby, beating with a suitcase. Several people were immediately knocked out and fell to the ground. Each person who fell was notified that minus 300 million had been debited from their account. The fallen people began to look at their watches in panic and scream that their money had been written off. Others who were still standing aside looked at each other in panic and asked that if they were hit with this bag even once, then minus 300 million would immediately be written off from the account. Kim Joo-hyuk gave off a menacing aura as he asked the others why they suddenly didn't want to come near him anymore. The others immediately panicked and asked him to wait for at least 1 second. Another voice said that the risk was too great. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled all over his face and asked if he should have approached him then. People immediately began to back away from him, holding their weapons in front of them and telling him not to dare come closer and for someone to throw something at Kim Joo-hyuk to stop him. People around grabbed heavy objects and one of the voices shouted for everyone to throw at him at the same time if they attacked him from here. Kim Joo-hyuk began to fight off all the projectiles with his suitcase, smiling madly with a bloodthirsty smile. One of the guys looked at him puzzled and realized that this wasn't working either. Kim Joo-hyuk approached him, and the man's shadow loomed over his face. He looked up and saw Kim Joo-hyuk jumping up with his suitcase at the ready. He immediately landed on his head and hit him with the suitcase, and he immediately received a notification that -300 million had been written off. He fell face down into the ground, and the system said that R36 had gone bankrupt. The rest began to tremble in fear and say that it already looked like some kind of madness. Kim Joo-hyuk looked over his shoulder, a creepy aura emanating from him as he asked them about who wants to be the next one to be beaten for 300 million. Even the two men, whose faces were covered with masks, watched all this in silence while they slowly began to sweat. Some started trying to take off their bracelets and saying that they were giving up and that they didn't want to participate in this, when another said that even if they gave up, they would just withdraw 100 million. Another said it was better than getting hit for 300 million and going bankrupt. People started running away from Kim Joo-hyuk and screaming that they didn't really want to die because they were bankrupt. Kim Joo-hyuk watched them run away and turned to those who remained standing nearby and were still surrounding him. He clarified whether they were going to hold out until the end. One of the men frowned and replied that in any case they had nowhere to retreat anyway. Another man next to him said that he had a debt of 900 million. Kim Joo-hyuk grinned madly and told them to shut up and come to him. All those remaining simultaneously rushed towards him, swinging their weapons. Kim Joo-hyuk said okay. His eyes lit up through his glasses, and with that same smile, he told them that they should have done this from the beginning. There was a loud scream. The drone continued to hover in the air as the screams continued to ring out one after another. The masked men watched in silence, sweating. A drop of blood fell to the ground as one of the beaten men fell to the ground like everyone else. Kim Joo-hyuk held the beaten man, complaining that his suit seemed to be torn. He looked over his shoulder and noticed that the suit now had several holes. The remaining beaten people were lying around him. A system notification appeared indicating that the remaining time had expired. Then the next notification, which said, "Mission accomplished, plus 300 million. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately beamed when he saw this notification, his cheeks turning pink as he happily said that it's okay because now he can just buy a new suit. Another system notification was displayed, in which it was written, "The owner of the bag has been identified. We ask all participants to disperse." Kim Joo-hyuk threw his bag over his shoulder, putting his other hand in his pocket, and began to walk away. He gave a final wave to the beaten people behind him and added in the end that it was quite funny. The girl leaned against the wall, crossing her arms over her chest. She had short dark hair and dark eyes and said that this member definitely wouldn't last too long. She asked the others' opinions, and the shadow said that yes, although he was quite conspicuous, and it was possible that he even attracted too much attention to himself, and he doesn't even realize how dangerous it is. Every day was similar to the previous one. A man runs like a squirrel in a wheel. A work routine without a single hint of any purpose. Kim Joo-hyuk sits at a computer in a completely dark office, returning to a dark, empty house. Many identical pairs of shoes stand in the aisle, when you are already falling on the move from fatigue. However, today everything was different. Hotel Sigrol. A tall multi-story building rose up. Next to it there were green trees that grew along the river flowing nearby. 20 million for one night in a luxury room. The room was richly furnished. The tall windows afforded a beautiful view of the city as the lamps above shone and glittered. There were several dishes of gourmet food on the table. He received an amount that he previously would not have earned in 10 years in just 4 days. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled, beads of sweat dripping from his face, and his cheeks were flushed. Balance 580 million. He clenched his hand tightly into a fist, plus another 300 million in cash. Kim Joo-hyuk raised his clenched fist into the air and sighed contentedly, thinking that this is called life. If this continues, his dream of owning his own property will soon become a reality. Footsteps were heard and a girl in uniform with her hair pinned up entered the room. She smiled and said that it was room service and what the gentleman asked for. The girl opened the dish that was lying on the plate. Steak made from special Korean beef, a plus grade, prepared by a 3-star Michelin chef. Kim Joo-hyuk stuck his fork into a piece of sliced meat. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his mouth wide and put a piece into his meat, and at the same second he grabbed his mouth, his eyes widened. The girl smiled and asked how he was and whether the gentleman liked the taste. Kim Joo-hyuk grimaced, then broke into a smile of pleasure, saliva dripping from his mouth, angels flying around him. He replied that it was simply incredibly tasty. The girl hesitated and then took off her wig, showing short dark hair. She displeasedly told him that he really was too reckless and it was impossible to not worry about anything to that extent. Kim Joo-hyuk's eyes widened, staring at the girl as he continued to stuff his mouth with beef. He looked at her questioningly and greeted her hesitantly. The girl began to further remove her disguise and looked at him in surprise, noticing that he seemed not at all surprised by what was happening. She came closer to the table and asked if he was really a participant and how he could be so careless. Kim Joo-hyuk told her that he just knew from the very beginning, and the girl arched her eyebrow in response, looking at him questioningly. Kim Joo-hyuk turned away and told her that she had followed him from the construction site, just like the other person. He turned his gaze to the second man who was in the shadows. The man hesitantly scratched his cheek and said that's how it is, and Kim Joo-hyuk just let them follow him, despite the fact that he knew everything. The man smiled. He had gray hair and a grin on his face and eyes as gray as his hair. Kim Joo-hyuk started talking to them as the man sat down at the chair opposite him and said that he didn't know why exactly the two of them were following him, but they didn't seem dangerous to him. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to eat and added that he, in any case, wanted to ask someone about the missions since he already had a lot of questions. The man grinned and looked at him with a sly look, asking if Kim Joo-hyuk was trying to extract information from them. Kim Joo-hyuk looked back at him and said something like that. The man smiled and said that it was just a great time for something like this because he also wanted to ask him for something. The clock on the wall was ticking. The girl sat down in the middle of the table while the two men sat at the ends. He asked Kim Joo-hyuk how exactly he became a member. Kim Joo-hyuk replied that just like everyone else, he participated in missions after receiving the device, and at first there were test ones. The man looked at him carefully with a smile and asked why he didn't have a device on his wrist in that case. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled back and asked if there was any rule about where it had to be. He decided that it would be better if they didn't talk about his glasses. The girl covered her mouth with her hand and wondered if it should then be on his ankle, and was he really familiar with the questionnaires. Kim Joo-hyuk ignored her and crossed his arms, saying that it was now his turn to ask his questions. He turned to them and asked if they knew how to remove this device. The man asked that if he could set a price for his freedom, how much would he give for it? Kim Joo-hyuk frowned and asked what exactly he was talking about. The man bowed down, clasped his hands, and said that 2 billion was the price they set for freedom. And until they pay these people 2 billion, this device will never be removed. Kim Joo-hyuk frowned and asked if he meant cameramen by these people, and he confirmed his words. These scoundrels were the creators of hell, the real owners of the darknet. There were even rumors that there were tens of billions of illegal funds in their accounts and in the underworld they created. Participants suffered from missions and games, accumulated debts due to loan notes, went bankrupt and disappeared without a trace. And to date, no one has yet managed to regain their freedom. Kim Joo-hyuk asked why he was telling him all this. The man crossed his arms and replied that he was just trying to understand what kind of person he was, and whether freedom was important to him, or whether money came first. Kim Joo-hyuk chuckled and said that the question was too trivial. He smiled madly and said that he could just buy his freedom after he earned 10 billion. The man looked at him carefully and said that it seemed that money was more important to him. But why was he so confident that he could win in any of the missions? The man pointed his finger at his bracelet and asked if they should play a simple game in this case. A system notification appeared that said, R2 is requesting a closed random game. Accept. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled, bowed his head slightly and asked if this was some kind of test. And since he is not one to shy away from something like this, he will accept the challenge. A system notification appeared that said, please confirm information about your opponent. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes in surprise as diagrams flashed before his eyes. He wondered if this was another function of his glasses as he tried to understand what was now in front of his eyes. The man looked back at him and asked what exactly was wrong. Kim Joo-hyuk saw a system window that said, Rank 3, Guanmo, Personal Information, 14 wins, 1 loss, Available Funds 4.8 billion won. Kim Joo-hyuk chuckled as the system window popped up, warning that the game was starting and that you couldn't give up halfway through. He couldn't understand what was wrong with this man. The man opened his eyes, smiled and asked what kind of game it would be, and that he couldn't wait. Kim Joo-hyuk realized that once the game started, it could not be stopped. Kim Joo-hyuk hesitated and asked to wait a little, to which the man smiled back and said that it was already too late. He looked at the bracelet on his hand, which was glowing with a bright light. He added that the roulette had already started spinning. A system window appeared in which a 1-to-1 random game was selected. The next system window contained information, rock, paper, scissors, bones. Rules, the player with the highest final score wins. Another system window appeared with a description, 1 and 2 equals 2 points, 3 and 1 equals 3 points, 1 and 4 equals 4 points, 5 and 1 equals 5 points, 2 and 6 equals 6 points, 1 is the highest number if the number points are different, the highest will be counted to the player's account. The next window contained the second rule: 1 and 1 equals 1 point, 2 and 2 equals 4 points, 3 and 3 equals 9 points, 4 and 4 equals 16 points, 5 and 5 equals 25, 6 and 6 equals 36. 2 is a pair. If the number of dots is the same, then their product will be credited to the player's account, but if you get 1 to 6, you automatically win. The girl took out a small suitcase and opened it. It contained several rows of colored chips. She explained that each chip was worth 10 million won. Based on the player's balance, everyone will start with 88 chips. The man grinned and said, throwing the dice, that it was good that the game was so simple. He threw the dice into the glass and said that the white dice are thrown immediately and they make bets, and only after that the black dice will be known. Before raising the glass is prohibited. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him and asked if it was just a game of luck. He replied that this is so, but he is calm, which means he is confident in himself and his luck. Kim Joo-hyuk chuckled at his words. Yes, how was this possible? Kim Joo-hyuk screamed inside himself, but on the outside he showed a confident look, smiling and adjusting his glasses on his face, saying that only time will tell. To himself, he only thought that his life was simply the embodiment of bad luck. He never got the correct answer at random. Little Kim Joo-hyuk sat at his school desk, tossing a pencil, and he never won the lotteries. He remembered the forms with the inscription that, unfortunately, he did not win. He had never been lucky in this life, but somehow he got to this point. Suddenly, Kim Joo-hyuk seemed to go blue. He thought about it. He earned 880 million in 3 days. Kim Joo-hyuk raised his head and grinned. This was the current him, and that meant only one thing. The man interrupted his thoughts and asked if he was ready. It is possible that he can turn this failure into a new opportunity. Kim Joo-hyuk clenched his fist tightly. With a loud shout, he threw the dice onto the table and got a 1. His face immediately became covered with sweat as he opened his eyes wide, looking at the value of the white die. He immediately wondered what about the number of the man in front of him. Kim Joo-hyuk looked sharply and saw the slightly puzzled face of a man who was rubbing his chin and talking about the fact that, unfortunately, he had a small number. There were 2 dots on his white cube. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately broke out in a sweat when he saw the 2, but he decided that it was not the end and that everything depended on the second dice in the glass. The man raised his finger, smiled and said that he would bet 100 million. Kim Joo-hyuk thought that the man really bets as much as 100 million in such a situation, in the first round in such an amount. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately imagined himself standing on the edge of an abyss. A notification popped up informing him that if he surrendered, all his funds would be lost. He realized that he had nowhere to retreat. Kim Joo-hyuk stared in front of him, waiting, his face slowly becoming covered with sweat. He said the bet was accepted. The girl stood up and said that in this case she would now open the second bone. The girl grabbed the glass and began to slowly lift it, talking about what the second dice was for the first player. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately froze in anticipation, and the man smiled. He got the number 3 on the black die. Due to the mismatch of numbers 2 and 3, the score of the first round is equal to 3 points. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately smiled contentedly to himself while sweating, because it was much less than he thought. He can win if he gets a 4, 5 or 6. Kim Joo-hyuk clenched his fist in his hand and smiled contentedly. The girl began to lift the second glass, showing off the second bone. Removing the glass, she revealed that the second die also had a 1. Kim Joo-hyuk's face immediately contorted in horror when he saw a system notification that player number 2 had lost and 100 million had been debited from his account. Kim Joo-hyuk lowered his head and trembled as the man looked at him and smiled, saying that it was even incredible that he got a pair in the first round, and if this was an ordinary game of dice, wouldn't it be for her? Pretty good deal. Kim Joo-hyuk looked gloomy, giving off a gloomy aura as the veins popped out on his face. He said that since he got rid of his bad luck in the first round, then everything would definitely change from the second. The chips were scattered on the table, and there were signs with rules hanging around. His hand trembled, and the next moment Kim Joo-hyuk realized in horror that 500 million seemed to have evaporated. Kim Joo-hyuk had already given up the ghost a little when the girl looked at him worriedly and silently and said that now they can move on to the final round. She told them to throw the first die, and 2 dice hit the table. Player 1 rolled a 1, and player 2 rolled a 6. Kim Joo-hyuk immediately bared his teeth and smiled, looking at his opponent from under his brows. He finally succeeded. Kim Joo-hyuk wanted to say that he was betting 300 million, but the man interrupted him and said all in. He stared at him while holding his chips and told him that he would give him a chance, and if Kim Joo-hyuk won, he would get everything. Kim Joo-hyuk couldn't believe what he just told him. He decided that the man must have gone crazy, or he was extremely confident that he would get the number 6. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him with an uncertain face. He had already checked, but there was definitely no cheating with bones and a glass. There was no way to falsify the result here. Kim Joo-hyuk was silent for a couple of seconds, but then accepted the bet. The girl took the glass and said that she was opening the second bone. Kim Joo-hyuk thought to himself that if only he had known what kind of person he was, he would definitely never have gotten involved in the game. The image of a man appeared before my eyes, with predatory eyes. He smiled as a huge white and giant snake with red eyes wriggled behind him, above his head. The man's gray eyes sparkled with anticipation. The glasses began to be raised slowly as the man smiled in anticipation. White snake absorbing good luck. He was a legendary gambler, while Kim Joo-hyuk was only his victim. As if enveloped by a huge giant snake, which opened its mouth, wrapping its tail around Kim Joo-hyuk and grabbing him in a ring of its body, the snake opened its mouth wide, ready to attack and showing off its pairs of huge sharp teeth. Kim Joo-hyuk was incredibly small compared to such a monster. A huge snake rushed towards him, its mouth wide open and ready to swallow him whole. At the same moment, a system notification appeared stating that there were 6 dots on the second die of player 1, and 1 plus 6 meant that it was an automatic win. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled while his tears flowed like a river and the entire amount was debited from his account. He immediately said goodbye to all his fortune earned during the game. All his luck immediately disappeared. The man stood up and smiled, looking over his shoulder and saying that it was fun and it would be nice to meet again. He held a silver business card in his hands, squeezing it between his 2 index and middle fingers. Finally, he added that if he finds something more important than money, then he should definitely find him. He threw the business card on the table while Kim Joo-hyuk sat and did not understand what happened, drooling from his mouth. The next evening, it was already dark outside, and the building outside was lit with signs. The employees were sitting at a table in the establishment. Many people were sitting at a long table, on which there were drinks and various kinds of snacks. When one of the men, in a gray shirt and dark tie, with a receding hairline, stood up from his seat with a mug of beer in one hand. He said loudly that everything was just fine and well done to everyone who came, because they had been around for a long time. We didn't get together like this. He also added to them that they should not be embarrassed in any way and relax with all their hearts. Everyone here took their glasses filled with beer and began to clink their glasses, each thanking each other for their extremely hard work. The boss was holding a beer in his hands, taking a sip, when he looked back in the direction of Kim Joo-hyuk, who was gloomily sipping a drink from a bottle from a straw. His face was murderous, which everyone immediately felt. Everyone looked at him with a blank expression, and the boss smiled nervously when he noticed the way Kim Joo-hyuk looked. He noticed that Kim Joo-hyuk was gloomy from the very beginning of the working day, and even at a corporate party he behaves the same way. The boss continued to look at him for a while with a mug of beer in his hands. However, he immediately turned away and realized that although he did not know what had happened, if he did something wrong, then he would definitely be finished. He immediately broke out in a sweat, burying his face in his glass while Kim Joo-hyuk sat one person across from him and drank his beer through a straw, emitting a menacing aura. Another colleague sitting between them lowered his head slightly, sensing the atmosphere between the two. Suddenly, Kim Joo-hyuk's dark thoughts were interrupted by a voice as he continued to sip his drink through a straw in the same manner. The man who approached and asked his name leaned slightly over where Kim Joo-hyuk was sitting and crossed his arms behind his back. Kim Joo-hyuk turned at the sound of the voice and saw before his eyes a stout man in a dark suit with a short haircut standing in front of him. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him, not particularly interested when the stranger said that they were having a corporate event here, and he looked somehow completely unimportant. It was the president of the company, B-Duck Man. The man smiled good-naturedly, a slight blush on his cheeks as he asked with a smile on his face if Kim Joo-hyuk had any problems at work. Kim Joo-hyuk silently looked at the man who continued to stand next to him with a smile on his face. He said nothing and immediately began drinking his drink through a straw again with a gloomy expression on his face. The boss who was sitting next to him was immediately horrified and thought to himself that he was definitely crazy, and in front of them was none other than the president of the company himself. The boss opened his mouth in surprise and widened his eyes, watching this picture. Is Kim Joo-hyuk not even going to look at him? The boss immediately stood up and began to sweat, hesitantly saying that the president should not worry and that this was not the case at all. He smiled nervously and hesitated in place. The president waved his hand and, with the same good-natured smile and aura, said that everything was fine, and that it must have been that it was simply difficult for him to talk about it here. The president came closer to him and put his hand on Kim Joo-hyuk's shoulder, asking him why don't they go out for a while. Kim Joo-hyuk sat with the same gloomy expression on his face, clutching the almost empty bottle in his hand. The rest of the workers started talking among themselves, and one of the girls said that Mr. Joo-hyuk was quite strange. Another voice said that since the president had drunk, they should go home early. They continued to sit at the table when Soo-yeon, who was sitting next to them, glanced in the direction where the two of them had gone. The girl who was sitting next to her said, covering her mouth and smiling, that she heard that something happened to Mr. Joo-hyuk with his investments. She giggled at the look on his face today. Soo-yeon was silent, looking down. She glanced sideways in her direction and asked if everything would be okay. Soo-yeon's face looked a little worried. The girl said that the president had not yet been drunk to such an extent, so everything was quite possible. Another girl with a smile on her face said that he was actually a good person if he didn't drink too much. And the second one confirmed his words and added that because he almost always smiles, he was nicknamed the Smiling Buddha. The president stood opposite Kim Joo-hyuk with a red face, continuing to smile in the same way. Saliva dripped from his mouth and he panted while his eyes glowed red. He spoke rudely to Kim Joo-hyuk, calling him over. The drunken president came closer and grabbed him by the tie, saying that as an ordinary employee, shouldn't he know his place? Kim Joo-hyuk looked at him with a gloomy face and did not answer. The president continued and added that he should stop spoiling their corporate party with his sour face, and it would be better for him to go and have fun. The president let him go and walked away slightly, spreading his arms to the sides and continued to slander, saying that he did not understand at all what was wrong with his generation, and how could they be so unambitious and insensitive. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to stand silently in front of him, his head slightly lowered. The president continued to talk and added that the reason why he cannot rise above the petty bourgeoisie is because Kim Joo-hyuk earns only 30 million a year by the sweat of his brow, and that a freak like him can be replaced at any time. At the same time, the president did not hesitate to insult him, while Kim Joo-hyuk still silently listened to him with his head bowed. He was thinking about his 880 million when he looked up and looked at the president in front of him. He understood that it would be difficult to earn them here even over decades. The president continued to say something, pointing his finger in his direction. Kim Joo-hyuk thought that would he really have to work his whole life for such people, like a slave, to earn that kind of money again. He looked at the face of the president, who was all red from alcohol, and opened his mouth so wide that saliva began to dangle from it. Suddenly, Kim Joo-hyuk was pulled out of his own thoughts and punched on the cheek. Out of surprise, he did not even have time to react, surprised by the sudden blow to the face. The president drew attention to himself and continued to smile, slightly squinting his eyes with red cheeks. He raised his hand and told Kim Joo-hyuk that he would be willing to give him 100,000 won for every slap he gave, and that Kim Joo-hyuk would be better off just thanking him for raising him like that. Kim Joo-hyuk looked ahead, trying to contain his anger, his eyes sparkling unkindly under the lenses of his glasses. All he could think about was that he really wanted to break his arm at the moment if he dared to hit him one more time. Suddenly a system notification appeared saying that a new task had appeared. Kim Joo-hyuk opened his eyes in surprise when he saw the red sign in front of his eyes. Kim Joo-hyuk stood silently and realized that he had changed his mind. The president approached him again and began to deliver another slap right across his face. Kim Joo-hyuk suddenly thanked the president. The president stopped with the same smile on his face and drool running down to his chin. He stared questioningly at Kim Joo-hyuk when he heard his words. Kim Joo-hyuk folded his hands and with an admiring face told the president that thanks to his words, he was now finally able to look at the world soberly. While Kim Joo-hyuk was saying this, he seemed to have the radiance of sudden insight emanating from him. The president looked at him in surprise, and the guy added that now he finally understood what exactly is called a real life and wise lesson. The president generally stopped understanding what was happening, smiling with a reddened face, and tried to put his hand in front of him so that he would slow down a little, because he did not understand the reasons for what was happening at all. Kim Joo-hyuk, meanwhile, continued to say that even if it was just for one day, he would be immensely grateful for the opportunity for this unworthy person to have such an honor to be by his side. Kim Joo-hyuk walked closer to the president and grabbed his hands, clasping them in his own with a smile on his face. The president gave him a puzzled look as Kim Joo-hyuk added and asked if he could stick around to receive more of Mr. President's wisdom. The man immediately smiled and said that all he had to do was look at this cute rascal, and that this was a different matter. The president smiled contentedly, looking at him with his narrowed eyes and red cheeks. The president grabbed him by the shoulders as Kim Joo-hyuk supported him, and the man said that in that case, they should go back and Kim Joo-hyuk would pour him a drink. Holding each other like this, they headed back. The president also added that, in turn, today they will definitely go to the end. Kim Joo-hyuk agreed with him. He walked with a neutral face, while the stunned president continued to smile contentedly, leaning on the young guy. A system notification appeared that said, "Please kidnap the president, reward 500%. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled madly, his smile stretching from ear to ear and his eyes rolling back in anticipation. He was ready to go to the very end. The kidnapping operation begins. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to walk along the street, holding a drunk president who had already bowed his head and allowed himself to lead. The gold ticket lay on the ground. The president slowly opened his eyes. The first thing he saw were men's shoes. He opened his eyes fully, his face red as he came to his senses. He raised his face and asked with a surprised face what was happening here. The man was tied to the table with a strong rope, and Kim Joo-hyuk stood in front of him. He smiled maliciously, holding a rope in his hands and answering that what else could have happened, the president was kidnapped. A system notification was displayed that said, "After abduction, please lock the target for 24 hours in the specified zone. Remaining time is 16 hours, 1 minute and 55 seconds. The map shown showed various buildings and where the victim was to be locked up. The president opened his eyes in surprise and asked Kim Joo-hyuk what kind of nonsense he was doing, and hadn't this joke already crossed all boundaries. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to hold the rope in his hands and asked him if he remembered what happened. Kim Joo-hyuk remembered how the crazy president galloped next to him. He lowered his gaze and continued, saying that he himself continued to tell him that he did not want to go home. Until 4 in the morning the president dragged him, an employee, along with him and created various scenes. The president listened and watched intently, sweat rolling down his face. Kim Joo-hyuk continued and said that he followed his request, and what should he have done now if he continued to behave like this? The president told him to immediately untie him and bring him his phone, and Kim Joo-hyuk took the phone out of his pocket, holding it out and asking if it was the right phone. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled while looking at the phone screen and said that he managed to dig into it a little while the president was sleeping and found something strange in it. The president gritted his teeth and swore at him. The next second, his face became distorted and he began to shout about whether Kim Joo-hyuk, a low-born fool, was going to untie him. He continued to scream and talk about how he even dared to kidnap him, and did he really think that he wouldn't get anything for it later? Did he really want to go to prison that badly? Kim Joo-hyuk looked back at the phone and replied that it was the president, who seemed completely unaware of his current situation. He turned the phone with the screen facing him, which contained indecent photographs of girls. With a deadly look, Kim Joo-hyuk said that if anyone was trash here, it was him. The president looked at him in shock when Kim Joo-hyuk asked if he installed a hidden camera in the company bathroom. The president asked how he was able to discover it. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to look at him murderously, saying that this probably did not fit into his head, but many inexplicable things were happening in our world. A system notification appeared that said, "Reward for the kidnapping mission, hacking skill unlocked." A phone screen appeared before my eyes, and next to it there was an inscription that a hacking was taking place. The president opened his mouth in shock and Kim Joo-hyuk asked if he was now aware of his situation. Kim Joo-hyuk leaned towards him and added that if he gave this information to the police, something interesting would happen. He looked at the phone again and said that it was now clear why he needed to steal it. Kim Joo-hyuk saw a separate folder on his phone and clicked on it, Company Employees, List of Rejected Sponsors. The president looked at him uncertainly when Kim Joo-hyuk said that he had something to ask. Danes appeared on Kim Joo-hyuk's face and his eyes became crazy as he asked who he thought the company's employees were anyway. The president looked at him from under his brows and said that they were all just dogs who had to obey their master, and because they did not know their place and behaved arrogantly, he simply gave them a chance. Kim Joo-hyuk squeezed the president's phone until it cracked. There was a look of rage on his face when he said that everyone had their skeletons in their closet, but the president was even worse, and there would definitely be no salvation for him. The president grinned and exhaled, talking about what now? Is he really going to commit a crime and intimidate him? Kim Joo-hyuk interrupted him and covered his mouth with his hand, saying that from now on he will give him 100,000 won for every slap. Kim Joo-hyuk raised his hand, saying that he should just be grateful and accept it, and think of it as patience training. The president immediately screamed and shouted that he did not dare even touch a hair of him, when a strong slap in the face immediately interrupted him. Kim Joo-hyuk hit him with a satisfied smile on his face, so hard that the tied-up president fell on his side on the ground. Kim Joo-hyuk sat down next to him and said that just because he had some money, did he really think that he could live like this and that in reality he was just a loser. Kim Joo-hyuk picked up the man and put him back in his original place. The president asked him to slow down and asked what exactly he wanted from him. Kim Joo-hyuk replied that he may not know, but living like everyone else was too difficult. Work, earn money and live happily. The president looked at him with wide eyes when Kim Joo-hyuk approached and added that even this is already too difficult, so also scoundrels like him are always crawling from all corners and getting in the way. Kim Joo-hyuk began to hit him again and ask him why he did it. Did he really like to mock normal people so much? Did he really like to watch from his top? The president began to sweat when his cheek was already swollen from the blows and he asked what he really wanted from him. Kim Joo-hyuk said he only wants one thing. He stood opposite the president and clenched his hand into a fist, adding that he wanted him to feel this injustice at least once. The man immediately began to tremble, and his face began to turn pale. The president began to stutter and say that he was wrong when they were interrupted and burst in from behind. Behind Kim Joo-hyuk stood a man with a knife at the ready. The second man came in next, when one of them said that they could save him, when the second asked what was the matter with him. The president immediately started screaming and begging for them to save him and that this fool had kidnapped him. The stranger replied that they already knew that, so the old man just needed to stay there and wait. The watch on the stranger's hand beeped and said, "Please rescue the kidnapped civilian at these coordinates, reward 200 million won." Kim Joo-hyuk turned to face them when one of the men said no offense, and he should have known that they were just also on their own mission. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and waved his hand, saying that he knew and that everything was fine. The two men immediately became worried and looked at each other, talking about what was wrong with him and why he was so calm. One of them looked over and asked what they should do when someone else's shoe was already next to his face. The blow immediately hit his face and he instantly flew into the wall. The other one looked back at him in surprise. The dust cleared and Kim Joo-hyuk's hand reached towards his face. He began to strike him quickly, and the second man fell to the ground just as quickly, knocked it out in 2 seconds. Later, several more participants came. The president was shaking and sweating as he watched everything. Each time, only one thing was confirmed: how different their level was from Kim Joo-hyuk. Kim Joo-hyuk continued to throw one blow after another at the men who came with flying blows. The president began to get more and more nervous and thought to himself that at such moments he should somehow try to escape, but even if it was not a rope. Suddenly the knife was behind the president, cutting his ropes. He immediately opened his eyes in horror when he saw Kim Joo-hyuk smiling next to him with a knife in his hand. The president immediately fell to the ground and backed away. Kim Joo-hyuk said that he seemed bored and that's why he came to him, and that's why he wants to cheer him up. Kim Joo-hyuk grabbed his legs and pulled him towards him. The president wanted to ask him to wait when he began to spin it around its axis. Director Deok Man had only one thing on his mind as he lost consciousness. One of the strange men screams loudly before trying to escape. The president only thought that this fool was really using him as a weapon now. The president bumped into the fleeing man as Kim Joo-hyuk's body slammed him. The president fell to the ground next to another man. This was the first time he had been treated so mercilessly. Kim Joo-hyuk began to move closer to him again while the president backed away and asked him to stop. In front of a madman with whom it was impossible to come to an agreement, in the end the president himself began to cry like a baby. Tears streamed down the president's face. Kim Joo-hyuk put his finger to his lips and asked him to be so quiet. He smiled as he leaned over him and ordered him to stop, and why did he suddenly burst into tears? After all, they still have a full 15 hours ahead, and during this time he will help the president be reborn. He opened his eyes in horror and began to sweat. A loud scream was heard from outside the brick building. 2 men sat in the bushes and watched carefully what was happening. One of them said that 5 teams had already entered, and the fact that they entered and did not leave could only mean one thing. The men looked at each other uncertainly when one of them said that it was better to leave and that they were abandoning this mission. Another said that he must have become physically weak by now. The guy answered him that sometimes there are such terribly strange and strong people, and if they want to survive, it would be better to retreat. They were either high-ranking players or crazy people with whom it was simply impossible to come to an agreement, and who knew perhaps he would soon become one of them. The guys turned around, looking back one last time. Kim Joo-hyuk stood over the director and asked if he had come to his senses. The president lay on the floor and looked at him in horror. The guy said that he thought just while he was unconscious that he was rich, and with money he could somehow appease the police and get out. The president looked at him carefully. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and added that he would take care of his psychological state especially for the president. But since this is such a special position, shouldn't they discuss his salary? Kim Joo-hyuk continued to stand in front of the president and said that it should be 5 times more than what he was earning now. And he would also have to change his position in the company, something that would allow him to earn with a minimum of work. Kim Joo-hyuk came closer and leaned over the man, adding that the most important thing, from now on, President B will be his dog. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled madly and added that until he becomes human again, they should stay together. Jail. The gray building stood under the night sky. A dark chamber with 4 walls covered in cracks. Prisoner number 3270. The guard came to the door and through the bars told him to stay here one more day, and very soon he would be able to walk free as much as he wanted. The guard smiled as his watch beeped and said, within 24 hours, let a first-degree criminal escape from prison, reward 500 million won. A bald man with handcuffs clasped behind his back was banging his head against the wall. He had a mask on his face that covered his mouth. He looked back at the voice, his forehead covered in blood. The system voice said that after you successfully complete the mission, the punishment game will begin. The tall multi-story building glistened under the light of the sun. People were crowding in one place when the boss entered the office and looked questioningly at the crowd. He came closer and asked what was happening here. One of the men told Chief Choi to look where the hand was pointing. He turned around in confusion and asked why. Suddenly his face turned pale. He saw Kim Joo-hyuk, who was sitting behind a luxurious chair and clasped his hands on the table, smiling contentedly. He said that although it seemed sudden, his position had changed slightly by order of the president. The boss made a face, not understanding what was happening. Why this particular scoundrel? The boss began to sweat, looking at Kim Joo-hyuk, who was smiling contentedly. Now he had his own office. Was he promoted by the president? Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and hummed a song, saying that he really hopes that they will work together. Kim Joo-hyuk sat at the table with his hands clasped under his chin. He thought that if he thought about it, after receiving these points, his principle of making money had radically changed. In a few days, he earned and lost money that he would have had to save all his life. All the money seemed to have disappeared. A system notification appeared asking, "Do you want to use the loan ticket?" Thanks to the mission and the ticket, he was able to return part of the amount. Kim Joo-hyuk looked at the phone screen, which showed that the account balance was 500 million won, and the current balance was 500 million won. Even though he now had 500 million won in his account, which appeared in just one day, there was a reason why he was completely broken. Kim Joo-hyuk's face changed slightly, frowning with displeasure. A system notification appeared that said, "Please earn 1 billion in 7 days, remaining time 1 day 4 hours, 2 minutes and 59 seconds. He had almost no time left. He remembered the puppet's words that if the mission failed, the entire amount would be reset to 0. Kim Joo-hyuk screamed in horror and his face distorted. He couldn't afford to lose this money because he didn't even have a ticket anymore. Kim Joo-hyuk slammed his fist on the table. It doesn't matter what kind of game or mission he gets as long as it appears as soon as possible. Jail. The gray building stood under a light sky. Several operators sat at a table, watching cameras on a computer screen. One of the men said that this was the decision-making center. Guard Wang, please report the situation. The bus was rushing along the road. Guard Van reported that he was with 10 escorted prisoners, the purpose of special surveillance in the visual zone, no emergency situations. The man was holding a walkie-talkie in his hands. The voice from the walkie-talkie replied that it was accepted and to contact them immediately in case of an emergency. The man smiled, holding a walkie-talkie in one hand and a bloody knife in the other as he accepted Sir's orders. The man approached the cage with the keys in one hand, smiling contentedly. He opened the cage and threw the keys into the hands of one of the prisoners, who caught them with his hands locked and looked at them in surprise. The man said that they could do whatever they wanted, adjusting his hat on his head with a smile and saying that no matter what they did, they still couldn't escape. He stood in the center and added that when the game started, the hackers would most likely take control of the police CCTV cameras and radios, and that they had better run as far as possible. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves and did not understand what they were talking about, and could he really let them go? The guard pulled down his sleeve and looked at his watch, smiling and saying that in any case, those who escaped from prison, no matter where they go, they still can't escape. A system notification popped up that said, "Penalty game, please hunt the escaped prisoners. You will receive a reward if successful." People desperate for freedom. Ko Chang-shik has several charges, including first-degree murder and theft. Prisoner number 2066, 100 million reward. Na Han-gu has several charges, including car theft and murder of a police officer. Prisoner number 2078, reward 100 million won. People desperate for money. Which one will be more dangerous? Handcuffs unchained the hands of all the prisoners. The last to free himself was a man with a mask on his face. He smiled and his eyes lit up. Prisoner number 3270, reward 500 million won. The prisoners immediately turned in his direction, their eyes glowing a bright red as they smiled bloodthirstily. They turned to him and asked what they should do now. The man sat and turned to one of the men, asking him about what he said, that he had money buried somewhere, and that they would go there first. He smiled, his face covered in many scars. He said he knew a smuggler, so they could get out of Korea as soon as they got the money. The bus was rushing along the road. A drone flew overhead. The man looked at the bracelet on his hand and wondered where they were going, and the second added that if they just quietly left somewhere, it would be better for them. One of the men took the harpoon in his hands, throwing it over his shoulder, and said that it was better to go, and they need to make it before the other participants start hunting for them, because there are not too many victims there anyway. Approximately 4 hours have passed since the start of the penalty game. The man shouted loudly and ordered to stop immediately, firing a harpoon. He immediately hit one of the prisoners in the leg, and he screamed loudly. He immediately fell to the ground. The man laughed and said that he was weak for a criminal, and that's why he needed to live a righteous life. He turned around with a smile on his face and asked if he was right when someone else's hand fell on his shoulder, and he added, as long as they caught them one by one, those scoundrels from watching wouldn't notice anything. The man behind him smiled and said that great minds think alike, and that he, too, was secretly catching someone. The prisoner smiled, holding his hand and saying that since the scoundrels with the same watch kept coming, it was prisoner 2804, reward 300 million. The man immediately turned around, sweating as 2804 held his harpoon and asked who they even were. He wanted to wait for him, but the prisoner sent him and swung the harpoon, cutting off his hand. The man immediately screamed loudly as both of his hands fell to the ground. 2804 approached the giant and said that he had dealt with the local pests and that Gichial was attacked by them while he was on watch. The giant stood in front of a man who was kneeling in front of him with his hands clasped behind his back and his head bowed. He asked how many people were involved. He leaned over and put his huge hand on the guy's head and smiled, saying who knew. Those who were hunted were participants. The man immediately crushed his head and blood splashed onto his face. With a smile, he said that he got tired of it so quickly that he didn't even count. The man immediately fell to the ground dead. The prisoner stretched his neck and said that in any case he had not had so much fun for a long time. Many corpses lay in one heap, stacked on top of each other. He turned away and said that enough was enough and that they needed to quickly find the money and get out of here or he would abandon those who could not find anything. The rest of the prisoners, with shovels in their hands, began to dig up the ground. The prisoner with the sickle came up and said that the villains were not gang members and that he was trying to figure out who they were, but information about their location had been transmitted to their watches and that there was a bounty on their heads. The giant immediately perked up when he heard about the reward. His face turned slightly red when he asked what about it and how much they would give for it. The man replied that it was 500 million, and the giant replied that he had always dreamed of getting a bounty on his head and finally his dream had come true. The prisoner laughed awkwardly and congratulated him. He was a little puzzled by his behavior and wondered if he was deliberately trying to appear stupid. 5 of their men were already dead, and this was hardly the end. He turned to another man who was dripping earth and asked how much money they had already found. He replied that there were 3 bundles of 500 million each, and that there were 3 more bundles left. He immediately grinned, thinking that he had decided to play big, and that 3 billion was even better than he had hoped. All he had to do was use this stupid monster, and it would be difficult to earn that much on his own. He laughed madly, thinking that with that kind of money he would definitely start life from scratch. Someone watched them through eyepieces and wondered what was going on there, and why one of them was dancing, while buried money was being dug up on the other side. He turned his gaze to the eyepieces and saw the corpses, realizing that it was much more dangerous than he thought. 2 men were sitting in ambush when one of them asked if they would participate, and the other answered him that of course, and it was not for nothing that they came here. He smiled and said that if you remember the buried money, then they definitely cannot retreat. Another agreed with him and said that this time they would play big. The third man hesitantly asked if they were doing the right thing by hunting people like game. Another came up and grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, indignantly talking about what kind of people we were talking about. And didn't he really see the lists of their criminal records, and that they were not people? 500 million, 300 million, and 4 more for 100 million each. He let him go and ordered him to pull himself together and did not forget that their lives were also at stake. One of the men was loading a crossbow and with a smile on his face added that they should catch them one at a time from a distance. After all, it was the most effective and safest method, keeping a distance and catching them one at a time. Kim Joo-hyuk jumped out of the bushes with a crazy smile and loudly agreed with them, saying that they really couldn't let them escape. The man immediately jumped up screaming and turned towards Kim Joo-hyuk. He told them that there was no point in being on guard all the time, and besides, he was just an ordinary office worker. The men immediately turned pale and sweated when they saw Kim Joo-hyuk with a machete on his shoulder and wondered if he was really just an ordinary office clerk. Kim Joo-hyuk smiled and asked if they were also members and that he had the perfect plan for them. Kim Joo-hyuk licked the machete with a crazy face and asked if they wanted to listen to his plan.